I had lived in that building for 32 years, and yet the doorman looked at me like I was a stranger. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You don't live here anymore." Those were the first words he said when I stepped out of the cab, still holding the handle of my suitcase, still wearing the same navy coat I'd left in 2 weeks earlier. The one I always wore on business trips because it made me feel composed, in control, like nothing in my life could shift without my permission. The late afternoon air was crisp, that early fall chill that settles into the sidewalks of Manhattan just before sunset, and everything about that moment felt normal, until it wasn't. I remember the way the glass doors reflected my face back at me, slightly older than I felt, silver hair tucked neatly behind my ears, lipstick still intact after a 6-hour flight, a woman who had spent decades building a life that looked, from the outside, stable, secure, untouchable. I had just returned from a consulting trip in Chicago, one of those routine obligations I never questioned because routine meant safety. Routine meant nothing changed while I was gone. But as I stepped toward the entrance, the doorman shifted his posture, blocking the door with a quiet firmness that didn't match the polite smile he tried to hold. His name was Luis. He'd been there for years. He used to greet me every morning with a nod and a "Good to see you, Mrs. Bennett." Today he didn't say my name. Today he wouldn't even meet my eyes. "There must be some mistake," I said, keeping my voice even measured, the way I had learned to speak in boardrooms full of men who underestimated me. "I live here." He hesitated, then reached into the small wooden podium beside him and pulled out a sealed envelope. My name was written on the front in a handwriting I recognized instantly, though I hadn't expected to see it like this, not here, not in his hands. He extended it toward me without a word, as if passing along something he didn't want to be responsible for. Around us, people moved in and out of the building, heels clicking against marble floors, conversations blending into the background, life continuing as if nothing had just shifted beneath my feet. I took the envelope slowly, feeling the weight of it before I even opened it, and in that moment I understood something without needing confirmation. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a clerical error. This was deliberate. I glanced up at Luis again, searching for some sign that this was all a misunderstanding, but he only gave a small, apologetic shake of his head. "They told me not to let you in," he said quietly, the words barely above a whisper, as if saying them any louder would make them more real. They. He didn't need to explain who they were. My fingers tightened slightly around the envelope, but my expression didn't change. Years of experience had taught me that reactions were currency, and I had no intention of spending mine in a lobby full of strangers. "I see," I said simply. And I did. More than he could have known. Because this moment, as abrupt as it felt, hadn't come from nowhere. It had been building, quietly, in the spaces between conversations, in the subtle changes I had chosen not to question. Daniel's shorter phone calls. Sophie's polite but distant smiles. The way certain topics, finances, ownership, the future of the apartment, had started to surface more often, always framed as casual curiosity, never as something urgent. I had noticed. I had just chosen to trust. Standing there now, suitcase at my side, envelope in my hand, I realized how carefully everything must have been arranged in my absence, how precisely timed it all was. 2 weeks. That was all it took. 32 years of living in that apartment, and 2 weeks were enough for them to decide I no longer belonged inside it. A cab honked somewhere down the street. The city moved forward. And I remained exactly where I was, just outside the doors that used to open for me without question. I didn't open the envelope. Not yet. Instead, I slid it into my purse with the same calm motion I used when filing important documents, as if this, too, was just another piece of business to be handled later. Because whatever was inside it, I already understood the message. They had changed the locks. They had changed the narrative. And they believed that would be enough to erase me. I adjusted the handle of my suitcase and took a slow breath, letting the air settle evenly in my chest. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger is loud. Anger is careless. And I had learned over a lifetime that the most effective responses are the ones no one sees coming. I gave Luis a small nod, not unkind, just final, and turned away from the building without another word. Behind me, the doors slid open for someone else, as if nothing had happened at all. As if I had never lived there. As if I had never mattered. But as I stepped back onto the sidewalk, One thought settled clearly in my mind, sharper than anything else that day. They thought they had locked me out. They had no idea what I still held the keys to. I walked for a few blocks without a destination, the steady rhythm of my heels against the pavement grounding me in a way nothing else could in that moment, each step measured, deliberate, as if I could maintain control simply by refusing to rush, refusing to react the way they might expect me to. The city had not changed in the 2 weeks I had been gone. The same street vendors stood on the corners, the same taxis rolled past in uneven lines, the same distant hum of conversations layered over the sound of traffic. Everything familiar, everything predictable, and yet something fundamental had shifted beneath me, something quiet and irreversible. I stopped at the corner of Lexington and 63rd, waiting for the light to change, though I could not have said why I stopped there, only that I needed a moment to let the reality settle without letting it overwhelm me. My phone felt heavier in my hand than it should have. I had not checked it since I left the building. Not in the cab, not on the sidewalk, not even when I first felt that subtle tightening in my chest that told me something was wrong. I had learned long ago that information is most useful when you are ready to receive it, not when it is forced upon you. When the light turned, I crossed the street slowly and stepped into a small cafe I had visited countless times over the years, the kind of place where the barista used to remember my order without asking. Today, the young woman behind the counter gave me a polite smile that held no recognition. "What can I get for you?" she asked. "Black coffee," I replied, my voice steady, almost detached, as if I were speaking for someone else. I chose a table near the window, setting my suitcase beside me, the envelope still tucked neatly in my purse, untouched, waiting. Outside, people passed by in a constant stream, each one absorbed in their own life, their own concerns, unaware that just a few blocks away, a woman had been quietly erased from her own home. I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup when it arrived, letting the warmth seep into my fingers, anchoring me. Then finally I reached into my purse and took out my phone. There were messages. More than I expected. Missed calls from Daniel. 2 voice messages. 1 text from Sophie. I did not open them immediately. Instead, I stared at the screen, noticing the timestamps. Most of them had come in within the last hour, right around the time my plane had landed. That was not coincidence. That was timing. Carefully planned, carefully executed. I tapped on Daniel's name first. The most recent message read, "Mom, we need to talk. Please call me as soon as you land." The one before that, sent earlier in the day, said, "I hope your flight went well. We made some decisions about the apartment that I think are for the best." For the best. I let the words settle, turning them over in my mind without attaching emotion to them. Not yet. Sophie's message was shorter. "I hope you understand. This is what is best for everyone moving forward." There was no apology, no hesitation, just a conclusion already decided, already finalized, as if my agreement had never been necessary. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my gaze drifting to the window, watching a woman across the street adjust her scarf against the wind, completely unaware of the quiet unraveling happening just a few feet away. It was almost impressive in a way. The precision of it. The confidence. They had not asked for permission because they had convinced themselves they did not need it. That I no longer had a place in decisions that concerned my own life. I picked up my phone again and opened the voice message from Daniel. His voice filled my ear, familiar and distant at the same time. "Mom, I know this might come as a surprise, but we have been talking about this for a while. The apartment is too much for you now, and Sophie and I think it makes more sense for us to take over. It is a family decision. We will help you find something smaller, something more manageable. Just call me when you get this." His tone was careful, measured, the same tone he used when presenting something he had already decided, leaving no real room for discussion. I ended the message before he finished speaking. Not because I needed to, but because I had heard enough. The explanation was not new. It was simply the first time they had chosen to say it out loud. I set the phone down beside my coffee and reached into my purse again. This time for the envelope. The paper was smooth beneath my fingers, the edges crisp, professional. I turned it over once, then slid a finger beneath the seal and opened it with a clean, precise motion. Inside were documents. Legal. Official. The kind that are meant to look final even when they are not. I scanned the first page quickly, my eyes moving over the familiar language, the formal structure, the signatures at the bottom. Daniel's name, Sophie's name, and there in the corner, a line referencing a transfer of authority that made my lips press together ever so slightly. Not anger, not shock, recognition. They believed they had done this properly, that they had followed the necessary steps, checked the right boxes, created something that could not be undone. I folded the papers carefully and slid them back into the envelope, then placed it on the table in front of me. My reflection in the window stared back, unchanged on the surface, composed, steady, a woman sitting alone with her coffee on an ordinary afternoon. No one looking at me would have known that, in the span of an hour, my life had been quietly rewritten without my consent. I lifted the cup to my lips and took a slow sip, letting the bitterness settle. They had made their move. Clean, efficient, final in their minds. But as I set the cup back down, one thought settled into place with absolute clarity. They had mistaken my silence for absence. And that was where they had made their first mistake. I did not call Daniel back right away. That was the first decision I made that day that truly belonged to me. Instead, I sat there in that quiet corner of the cafe, watching the city move past the window as if nothing had changed, as if the world had not just tilted slightly off its axis. I had spent most of my life responding quickly, solving problems as they appeared, stepping in before situations could unravel. It was how I built my career, how I raised my son, how I maintained a life that looked seamless from the outside. But this was different. This required something else. Something slower. Something more precise. I reached for my coffee again, though it had already begun to cool, and let the silence stretch around me. Because now that the initial shock had settled, something else was beginning to take its place. Not anger. Not yet. Clarity. I thought back to the last time Daniel and Sophie had visited the apartment together. It had been just a few days before my trip, a Sunday afternoon that had seemed ordinary at the time. Sophie had stood near the window, looking out over the city with that thoughtful expression she wore when she was calculating something behind the surface. "It is a lot of space for one person," she had said lightly, her tone almost casual, as if the thought had just occurred to her in that moment. I had smiled, not because I agreed, but because I recognized the direction of the conversation and chose not to engage it fully. Daniel had been quieter that day, moving through the apartment with a kind of restless energy, opening drawers, glancing at shelves, as if he were already seeing it through a different lens. I remembered how he had paused near the hallway closet where I kept my documents, the ones I had organized meticulously over the years, each folder labeled, each paper placed with intention. "Do you still keep all the property paperwork here?" he had asked, his voice too neutral to be innocent. At the time, I had answered without hesitation. Of course. Where else would I keep it? He had nodded, but there had been something in his expression, something fleeting, that I had not fully examined then. I was examining it now. Every small moment. Every overlooked detail. They were not random. They were not spontaneous. They were steps. Carefully placed. Carefully timed. I set my cup down and leaned back slightly, allowing myself to reconstruct the sequence with the same analytical precision I had used in countless business negotiations. 2 weeks ago, I left for Chicago. Before that, they visited. They asked questions. They observed. And sometime during those 2 weeks while I was away, they acted. The documents in the envelope confirmed that much. But what interested me more was not what they had done, but what they believed they had secured. Because people rarely act with such confidence unless they are certain they cannot be challenged. I reached for my phone again, this time scrolling past Daniel's messages and opening my contacts instead. There were names there I had not needed in years, professionals I had worked with, advisors who had helped me structure parts of my life long before Daniel ever took an interest in them. I paused on one name in particular. Richard Halpern, estate attorney. A man who had once told me in a quiet conference room filled with documents, "The strongest protection is the one no one thinks to look for." At the time, I had taken his advice seriously. I always did. I had built my life on the assumption that stability was not something you hoped for, but something you designed. Carefully, quietly, thoroughly. I had not thought about that conversation in years. Not because it was unimportant, but because it had never been tested. Until now. I did not call him immediately. Not yet. Instead, I opened the email application on my phone and searched for a specific thread, one that went back several years, one that most people would have forgotten existed. It took only a few seconds to find it. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before I opened the attached document, the familiar formatting appearing instantly, the language precise, deliberate, unmistakably legal. I read through it slowly, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted to confirm what I already suspected. And there it was. Exactly where I knew it would be. A clause. Simple. Quiet. Nearly invisible to anyone who did not know to look for it. I closed the document and exhaled softly, the first real shift in my breathing since I had stepped out of that cab earlier that afternoon. They had done their research. They had gathered information. They had taken action. But they had not asked the right questions. And because of that, they had missed something fundamental. Something that changed everything. I picked up my phone again, this time without hesitation, and pressed on Richard's name. The line rang once. Twice. Then his voice came through, steady, familiar. Margaret, it has been a long time. I allowed myself a small, controlled smile, the kind that never quite reaches the eyes. Yes, I said, my voice calm, measured, exactly as it had always been when I needed it to be. But I believe it is time we review something I put in place years ago. Outside the window, the light had begun to shift, the late afternoon fading into evening, the city casting longer shadows across the street. Inside, everything remained still, ordered, quiet. And for the first time since I had been stopped at those doors, I felt something settle firmly into place. Not fear. Not uncertainty. Control. They had made their move believing the story was already written. They were wrong. The story had only just begun. Richard did not ask many questions, which was one of the reasons I had trusted him years ago, and one of the reasons I trusted him now. Send me what you received, he said after I finished explaining the situation in the most direct terms possible, leaving out anything emotional, anything unnecessary. I took the documents from the envelope again, smoothed them flat against the small cafe table, and used my phone to scan each page carefully, ensuring every signature, every clause, every detail was captured clearly before forwarding them to him. The process was methodical, almost routine, and that was exactly what I needed. Routine creates distance. Distance creates clarity. When I finished, I placed the papers back inside the envelope and rested my hand lightly on top of it, as if anchoring it in place. Give me 10 minutes, Richard said. Do not respond to them yet. I agreed without hesitation. 10 minutes was nothing. I had waited longer for far less important answers. I set my phone face down on the table and allowed my gaze to drift again, this time not to the people outside, but inward, to a place I had not revisited in years. The day I signed those original documents. The day I made decisions that, at the time, felt excessive, almost unnecessary. It had been a quiet afternoon, not unlike this one, except I had been sitting in Richard's office instead of a cafe. The city noise filtered through thick glass windows, everything contained, controlled. He had walked me through each page with a level of patience that suggested he understood something I did not yet fully see. Ownership is not always what it appears to be on paper, he had said, tapping lightly on one section. And control is not always where people expect to find it. I remembered asking him if all of this was really necessary. After all, Daniel was my son. There had been no reason to suspect that one day I would need protection from him. Richard had not smiled. The strongest structures are built before they are tested, he replied. At the time I had nodded, signed where he indicated, and filed the documents away with the rest of my life, never expecting to need them. But I had kept them. Carefully. Precisely. Because that was who I was. Back in the cafe, the memory settled into place with a quiet sense of inevitability. Nothing that had happened today was beyond the reach of what I had already prepared for. The only difference was that now, the preparation mattered. My phone vibrated softly against the table, pulling me back to the present. I turned it over and saw Richard's name. I answered immediately. They made a mistake, he said without preamble, his voice calm but firm. I did not interrupt. I simply listened. What they filed gives the appearance of authority, but it is incomplete. The property is not held in your name alone in the way they believe. It is tied to a structure that requires conditions they cannot meet without your direct consent. I closed my eyes briefly, not in relief but in confirmation. So it is invalid, I said. It is contestable, he corrected. And more importantly, it is reversible. But we need to act precisely. No confrontation. No warning. Let them continue as if nothing is wrong. I allowed a small pause, considering his words, though I already understood the strategy. What do you need from me? I asked. Nothing yet, he said. I will prepare the necessary filings. In the meantime, you do not go back there, and you do not engage with them directly. If they contact you, you remain neutral. Let them believe their position is secure. Neutral. It was a familiar stance. One I had used many times in negotiations where the outcome depended on patience rather than force. Understood, I said. When the call ended, I remained still for a moment, the phone resting lightly in my hand. Around me the cafe continued its quiet rhythm. Cups being placed on tables, chairs shifting softly against the floor, conversations rising and falling in low, indistinct tones. Nothing in the room reflected the shift that had just occurred. Nothing needed to. I reached for my coffee again, now lukewarm, and took another slow sip, letting the bitterness linger a little longer this time. They believed they had removed me, that they had simplified their lives by deciding mine for me. They had even been considerate enough in their own way to frame it as something beneficial, something practical, something I should accept. I set the cup down and allowed myself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Not because the situation was amusing but because it was clear. Clear in a way that left no room for doubt, no room for hesitation. They had acted with confidence but not with understanding. And that difference would matter. I picked up my phone once more. This time opening Daniel's message again. Reading the words as if they had been written by someone I did not know. We made some decisions about the apartment that I think are for the best. I imagined him standing in my living room, speaking those words, convinced that he was stepping into something that belonged to him. I imagined Sophie beside him, her expression composed, satisfied, certain that everything had been handled properly. I did not feel anger. Not yet. What I felt was something colder. Something more controlled. They had changed the locks, filed the paperwork, taken possession of a space they believed was now theirs. And for the moment I would let them keep that belief. Because sometimes the most effective way to correct a mistake is to allow it to fully reveal itself before you move to undo it. I gathered my things slowly, placing the envelope back into my purse, adjusting the handle of my suitcase, and standing with the same quiet composure I had carried into that building earlier that afternoon. Nothing about me had changed on the surface. I was still Margaret Bennett. Still composed. Still in control. The only difference was that now, I knew exactly where I stood. And more importantly, I knew exactly where they did not. I did not go back to the apartment that night, and that was not hesitation, it was strategy. Instead, I checked into a hotel 3 blocks away. A place I had used before for business meetings, discreet, quiet, the kind of environment where no one asked unnecessary questions, and no one paid attention to who came and went. The room was on the 12th floor, facing the avenue, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the window, steady and indifferent. I placed my suitcase by the dresser, set my purse down on the desk, and stood there for a moment taking in the stillness. It was not unfamiliar. I had spent years traveling, adjusting to temporary spaces, living out of carefully packed routines. The difference now was not the room. It was the reason I was in it. I removed my coat slowly, folding it over the back of a chair with the same precision I used at home, then walked to the window and looked out at the street below. Somewhere just beyond those buildings, Daniel and Sophie were inside my apartment, moving through my space, opening my cabinets, sitting in rooms they believed were now theirs. I imagined the way Sophie would walk through the living room, her hand brushing lightly against the furniture, assessing, rearranging in her mind before making any physical change. I imagined Daniel standing near the bookshelf, perhaps pausing at the photographs I had kept there for years, images of him as a child, moments I had preserved carefully, never expecting they would one day be observed as artifacts of something he no longer valued. The thought did not hurt the way it might have once. It simply clarified something that had been forming for a long time. I turned away from the window and sat down at the small desk, opening my phone again. This time I did not avoid their messages. I selected Daniel's number and pressed call. He answered on the second ring too quickly, as if he had been waiting, watching, expecting this exact moment. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying a mix of relief and tension, the sound of someone who had prepared a script but was unsure how it would be received. I allowed a brief pause before responding, not long enough to seem distant, just enough to establish control. "I received your messages," I said, my tone even neutral, giving nothing away. There was a slight shift on the other end of the line, the sound of him adjusting his position, perhaps glancing toward Sophie, perhaps confirming that she was listening. "I know this is a lot to take in," he began, carefully choosing each word, "but we really thought this through. The apartment is too much for you, and it makes more sense for us to take responsibility for it now. We are just trying to make things easier for you." Easier. The word settled in the air between us, soft, almost considerate, and completely hollow. I did not challenge it. Not directly. "I see," I replied, the same two words I had used earlier that afternoon, the same calm delivery, unchanged. Silence followed, brief but noticeable. He had expected resistance, questions, emotion. Instead, he had nothing to respond to. Sophie's voice entered then, faint but deliberate, positioned just close enough to the phone to be heard. "We already spoke to the building management," she said, her tone smooth, controlled, the tone of someone presenting a completed transaction. "Everything has been handled. You will not need to worry about anything." I could almost picture her expression, composed, confident, the slight lift of her chin that suggested certainty. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting my gaze settle on the reflection in the darkened window across the room. "That is very efficient," I said, allowing just a trace of acknowledgement, nothing more. Another pause. Longer this time. They were listening carefully now, searching for something beneath my words, something they could not quite identify. "We can help you find a smaller place," Daniel added quickly, filling the silence. "Something closer to where you need to be. Less maintenance, less stress, less control." That was what he meant, though he did not say it. I let the suggestion pass without comment. "There is no need to rush anything," I said instead, my voice steady, almost reassuring. "I will take some time to consider what comes next." The phrasing was intentional. Consider. Not accept. Not agree. Just consider. It was enough to ease them, to give them the impression that the situation was moving in the direction they expected. "Of course," Daniel said, the tension in his voice softening slightly. "Take all the time you need." Sophie did not speak again, but I could feel her presence in the silence, calculating, evaluating, adjusting her expectations based on what she believed she had just secured. "I will be in touch," I added, then ended the call before either of them could say anything further. The room returned to quiet immediately, the faint hum of the city filtering through the window, steady and distant. I placed the phone on the desk and folded my hands in front of me, not in uncertainty but in completion. That conversation had served its purpose. They believed I was processing, adjusting, accepting the change as something inevitable. They believed their position was stable, secure. I stood and walked back to the window, looking out once more at the city lights stretching into the distance. Somewhere beyond them, my apartment remained exactly where it had always been, unchanged in structure, unchanged in value, unchanged in ownership in the way that truly mattered. They had stepped inside it, rearranged their understanding of it, and convinced themselves that presence meant possession. I allowed myself a quiet breath, slow and even, the kind that settles everything into place. Because now there was nothing left to question, nothing left to confirm, only timing. And timing, I had learned, is what separates a reaction from a resolution. I rested my hand lightly against the glass, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingertips, and for the first time since that afternoon, I allowed the smallest shift in my expression, not visible to anyone but myself. They thought the situation was finished, that the decision had been made. But in truth, they had only just taken their first step into something they did not yet understand. The next morning arrived without urgency, the kind of quiet, steady beginning that gives nothing away, and I allowed it to unfold on my terms. I woke early, before the city had fully found its rhythm, the faint light filtering through the curtains of the hotel room casting soft lines across the floor. For a moment I remained still. Not because I was uncertain, but because I understood the importance of starting the day without rushing into it. Control is not only in what you do but in how you begin. I rose slowly, following the same routine I had kept for years, deliberate and unchanged, as if nothing in my life had shifted. I prepared coffee using the small machine on the counter, the quiet hum filling the room, grounding me in something familiar. Then I sat at the desk, my phone placed neatly in front of me, waiting. Right on time it vibrated. A message from Richard. Documents are ready. We proceed today. No elaboration. None needed. I read the message once, then set the phone down without responding immediately, allowing the words to settle into the space around me. Proceed. That was the only word that mattered. Everything before this point had been preparation, observation, confirmation. Now it was movement. I finished my coffee, the taste sharp and steady, then stood and gathered my things with the same care I always did, each motion precise, each decision intentional. I dressed in a charcoal gray suit, the one I reserved for meetings where clarity and authority were required, and fastened my watch with a small, practiced motion. Nothing about my appearance suggested disruption. Nothing about it suggested loss. When I stepped out onto the street, the air was cooler than the day before, carrying that early morning edge that sharpens everything slightly. The city was waking, but not yet crowded, the sidewalks open enough to move without interruption. I walked the few blocks to Richard's office without hesitation, my pace steady, my posture unchanged. Inside, the building was as it had always been, quiet, controlled. A space where decisions were made without spectacle. Richard was already waiting when I entered, seated behind his desk, a thin stack of documents arranged neatly in front of him. He did not stand, did not offer unnecessary greetings. He simply gestured to the chair across from him. We move carefully, he said as I sat. Everything is prepared, but timing remains critical. I nodded once, indicating I understood. He slid the documents toward me, each page marked with precise tabs, each section organized in a way that required no explanation. I reviewed them quickly, not because I needed to read every word but because I needed to confirm alignment. It was all there. Every safeguard, every clause, every quiet structure I had put in place years ago, now ready to be activated. They believe they have control, Richard continued, his tone even analytical, which means they will not expect resistance yet. That gives us the advantage. Advantage. A word I understood well. What happens next? I asked. We file the notice, he said. Then we allow it to reach them through the proper channels. Not directly from you. Not emotionally. Formally. That distinction matters. I considered that for a moment, though the logic was already clear. This was not a confrontation. This was a correction. And the building? I asked. Management will be notified as well, he replied. Their position will shift as soon as the documentation is processed. Access will be restored. Quietly. Quietly. That was the only way this would work. No scene. No announcement. Just a shift that could not be ignored once it occurred. I signed where indicated, each signature placed with the same calm precision I had used years ago when I first structured everything. There was no hesitation in my hand. No doubt in my mind. When I finished, I slid the documents back toward him. He gathered them immediately, placing them into a folder with practiced efficiency. It will begin today, he said. I stood, smoothing my jacket with a small, unconscious motion, then paused for a moment before speaking again. They believe I am adjusting, I said. Let them, Richard replied simply. I gave a small nod and turned to leave, the conversation complete. Nothing left to discuss. Outside, the city had fully come to life, the sidewalks now filled, the noise rising to its usual level. But none of it felt overwhelming. None of it felt uncertain. Because now, everything was in motion exactly as it needed to be. I walked without hurry, my steps measured, my path clear. Somewhere across the city, Daniel and Sophie were continuing their day, moving through my apartment with the confidence of people who believed their position was secure. They would check their messages. They would make plans. They would begin to settle into a life they thought they had successfully claimed. And at some point, without warning, something would shift. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to make it impossible to ignore. I stepped to the corner and paused briefly as the light changed, the familiar rhythm of the city continuing around me. Then I crossed, moving forward without looking back, because there was nothing behind me that required it. They had taken their step. Now it was time for mine to take effect. It did not happen all at once, and that was what made it effective. There was no dramatic interruption, no sudden confrontation, no raised voices echoing through hallways. Instead, it began quietly, the way all irreversible changes do. I was sitting in the same cafe as the day before, at the same table near the window, when my phone vibrated for the first time that afternoon. I did not reach for it immediately. I let it sit there, face down, allowing the moment to pass through me without urgency. When I finally turned it over, I saw Daniel's name. Not a message this time. A call. I watched it ring for a few seconds, considering the timing. Then I answered. "Mom," he said, and there was something different in his voice now. Not panic. Not yet. But something unsettled. Something that did not belong to certainty. "I just got a notice," he continued, his words coming more quickly than before, less controlled. "Some kind of legal filing. It says there is an issue with the ownership transfer. Do you know anything about this?" I leaned back slightly in my chair, my gaze drifting once again to the window, where the city moved forward exactly as it had the day before. "I am not surprised," I said calmly. Silence followed. Longer than before. This time he did not rush to fill it. He was thinking now. Adjusting. Trying to understand what he had missed. "What does that mean?" he asked finally, his tone tighter, more focused. "It means," I replied, choosing each word with care, "that not everything is as simple as it appears on paper." There was a faint sound in the background, the subtle shift of movement, and then Sophie's voice, no longer distant, no longer carefully positioned. This time she spoke directly. "We followed the proper procedures," she said, her tone controlled but edged with something sharper. "Everything was reviewed. Everything was approved." I allowed a brief pause before responding, not to create tension, but to let the weight of her certainty settle into place. "Then I am sure the review process will clarify everything," I said. There was no accusation in my voice. No challenge. Just a statement that left no room for argument. On the other end of the line, I could hear the shift more clearly now. Not just in their voices but in the space between them. The quiet exchange that happens when two people begin to realize they are no longer standing on solid ground. Daniel spoke again, his voice lower this time. "Mom, if there is something we do not know, you need to tell us." Need. The word stood out immediately. Not ask. Not discuss. Need. I almost smiled. "If there is something you do not know," I said evenly, "then it is something you should take the time to understand." Another silence. He did not respond right away. And when he did, the confidence that had been there the night before was no longer present in the same way. "We are just trying to make the best decision for everyone," he said, but now the words sounded less certain, as if he were repeating something he had already said too many times. "Of course," I replied. "And the best decisions are always supported by complete information." I ended the call before it could continue, before it could shift into something less controlled, something less useful. Because the conversation had already served its purpose. They had received the notice. They had read enough to understand that something was wrong. But they did not yet understand what. And that uncertainty would do more than any argument ever could. I placed the phone back on the table and picked up my coffee, now warm rather than hot, the temperature settling somewhere in between, much like the situation itself. Outside, a man hurried past, speaking into his own phone, his expression tense, his pace quick. Everyone, it seemed, was dealing with something. Most of it unseen. I took a slow sip and let the moment extend just a little longer. Because this was the shift. The point where confidence begins to fracture, not from external pressure, but from internal doubt. Somewhere across the city, Daniel and Sophie were no longer moving through my apartment with the same certainty they had the day before. They were reading, rereading, asking questions they had not thought to ask before, looking at documents that no longer felt as solid as they once did. I imagined Sophie standing in the living room, the same space she had likely claimed in her mind as her own, now holding a piece of paper that did not align with that belief. I imagined Daniel pacing slightly, his thoughts moving faster than his ability to organize them, trying to reconcile what he thought he knew with what was now in front of him. And for the first time they were not ahead of the situation. They were inside it. I set the cup down and rested my hands lightly on the table, not in tension, not in anticipation, but in quiet acknowledgement. This was exactly how it needed to unfold. No confrontation. No escalation. Just a gradual shift from certainty to doubt, from assumption to realization. Because once doubt enters, it does not leave easily. It grows. Spreads. It forces questions that cannot be ignored. I glanced at my phone once more, not expecting another call so soon, but prepared if it came. Because now the direction had changed. They had taken control too quickly, too confidently, without understanding the full structure beneath them. And now that structure was beginning to reveal itself, piece by piece, in a way that could not be reversed by conversation alone. I leaned back slightly, allowing the rhythm of the city to fill the space again, steady and uninterrupted. This was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of clarity. And clarity, once established, has a way of making everything else fall into place whether people are ready for it or not. By the time the second notice was delivered, they were no longer calling to explain, they were calling to understand, and there is a difference between the two that changes everything. I was no longer in the cafe when it happened. I had returned to the hotel, seated once again by the window, the city stretching out beneath me in that quiet, steady way that made everything feel inevitable. My phone rang just after 4 in the afternoon. This time I did not let it ring. I answered immediately. "Mom," Daniel said, and now there was no attempt to soften his tone, no careful framing, no rehearsed calm. "They are saying the transfer is invalid." "Not delayed. Invalid." I could hear movement behind him, drawers opening, papers shifting, the subtle chaos of people searching for something they thought they already had. "Yes," I said simply. The silence that followed was sharper now, more exposed. "Why?" he asked, and there it was, the question he should have asked before, the question that should have come before action, before assumption, before confidence. I stood from my chair slowly and walked toward the window, my reflection faint against the glass as the afternoon light began to fade. "Because," I said, my voice calm and even, "ownership is not always determined by what is filed last." Sophie's voice came in immediately this time. No longer controlled, no longer distant. "We have signed documents," she said, her words precise but edged with strain. "We have authorization. Everything was processed correctly." I let her words settle, not interrupting, not correcting, simply allowing them to exist long enough for their weakness to become apparent on its own. "Processing something correctly," I replied, "does not make it valid if the foundation is incomplete." There was a shift then, a deeper one, not just in their tone but in their understanding. They were no longer defending what they had done. They were trying to locate what they had missed. "What foundation?" Daniel asked, his voice lower now, more focused, stripped of everything except the need for clarity. I paused just briefly, not to create tension, but to ensure that what I said next would land exactly as it needed to. "The part you never asked about," I said. Silence followed again. But this time it was not confusion alone. It was recognition. The kind that comes too late, when the action has already been taken and the consequences have already begun. I could almost see it forming in their minds, the realization that their confidence had been built on partial information, that what they thought was complete had, in fact, been incomplete from the beginning. "There is a trust," Daniel said finally, the word coming out slowly, as if he had just discovered it in the documents in front of him. I did not confirm it immediately. I allowed the moment to breathe. "There has always been a structure in place," I said instead. "One that does not change simply because you decided it should." Sophie spoke again, but this time her voice carried something new. Not control. Not certainty. Calculation. "Then why were we able to file anything at all?" she asked. It was a better question. A more useful one. I turned slightly, resting my hand lightly against the glass, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingertips. "Because the system allows for process," I said. "But process is not the same as authority." The distinction settled heavily between us. I did not need to explain it further. They understood enough now to feel the shift, enough to recognize that what they had done existed in a space that could be undone. "So what happens now?" Daniel asked, and for the first time there was no attempt to guide the outcome, no suggestion of what should be done. Just a question. Open. Uncertain. I allowed myself a small breath before answering, not out of hesitation but out of precision. Now, I said. Everything is reviewed properly. Another silence. Longer. He did not ask what that meant. He did not need to. Because now the direction was no longer theirs to decide. Mom, he began again, but this time there was something else in his voice. Not authority. Not persuasion. Something closer to caution. We were only trying to. He stopped before finishing the sentence, as if even he could hear how incomplete it sounded. I did not fill the space for him. I did not soften it. I simply let it remain unfinished. Because some explanations do not need to be completed to be understood. I know what you were trying to do, I said quietly. And I did. That was never the question. The question had always been whether they understood what they were stepping into. Now they did. Or at least they were beginning to. We should talk about this in person, Sophie said, her voice steadier now, recalibrated, searching for a new position. I turned away from the window and walked back toward the desk. My movements unhurried, my expression unchanged. There will be time for that, I said. Not now. Not while the structure was still shifting beneath them. Not while the understanding was still forming. I ended the call before either of them could respond further, placing the phone down with the same quiet precision I had used throughout the day. The room returned to stillness, the city outside continuing without interruption, unaware of the recalibration taking place within a few miles of its center. I stood there for a moment, allowing everything to settle into place. They had moved from certainty to confusion, from confusion to recognition, and now they were approaching something else entirely. Accountability. Not forced. Not demanded. Just inevitable. I walked back to the window once more. The evening light now casting longer shadows across the buildings, the city transitioning into its night rhythm. Somewhere beyond those streets, Daniel and Sophie were no longer standing inside a space they believed was theirs. They were standing inside a situation they did not yet fully understand. And for the first time since this began, they were no longer ahead of it. They were catching up. Slowly. Carefully. And far too late to control the outcome. I did not raise my voice, and I did not need to, because everything that mattered had already been decided long before I walked back through that door. The room held a quiet tension. Not sharp, not explosive but settled, like dust after something has already fallen into place. Daniel stood a few steps away from me, no longer moving, no longer pacing, as if motion itself no longer served a purpose. Sophie remained near the edge of the living room, her posture still composed on the surface, but the certainty that once defined her presence had shifted into something more careful, more measured. I did not look at either of them immediately. Instead, I let my attention rest on the space itself, the familiar arrangement of furniture, the subtle changes they had made, the small attempts to claim something that had never been available to them in the way they believed. A chair slightly angled differently, a stack of papers placed where I never kept them, a vase moved just a few inches to the left. Details. Small, almost insignificant, and yet they revealed everything about what had happened here in my absence. Not just action but assumption. I walked slowly across the room, my steps quiet against the floor, and reached the table where I had set my purse earlier. I adjusted it slightly, aligning it with the edge, restoring a small piece of order without announcing it. Then I turned to face them fully. This will be corrected properly, I said, my voice calm, steady, without emphasis. Daniel nodded again, more quickly this time, as if agreement was the only position left available to him. Of course, he said, but the words lacked the weight they once carried. They were no longer leading anything. They were following. Sophie's gaze remained fixed, her expression more controlled now, but no longer anchored in certainty. We did not intend for this to become complicated, she said, choosing her words carefully, as if each one needed to be tested before it was spoken. I considered that for a moment, then gave a small nod, not in agreement but in acknowledgement. Most things become complicated when they are approached without full understanding, I replied. There was no accusation in my tone. No need for it. The situation itself had already made the point more clearly than any words could. Silence followed again, but this time it was different. Not tense. Not uncertain. Just settled. The kind of silence that comes when everything that needed to be revealed has already been revealed. Daniel shifted slightly, his shoulders lowering. The energy that had driven him before now replaced with something quieter, something closer to reflection. What happens now? He asked, and this time the question was not about control. It was about direction. I let the question sit for a moment before answering, not because I needed time, but because I wanted the answer to land exactly where it belonged. Now, I said, everything returns to where it has always been. He nodded slowly, as if absorbing the meaning beyond the words themselves. Sophie did not respond immediately, but I could see the shift in her posture, the recalibration of someone who understood that the position she thought she held no longer existed. I turned away from them then, not dismissively, but because there was nothing left to resolve in that moment. I walked toward the window once more. The city light stretching out beyond the glass, steady, consistent, unchanged by anything that had occurred inside this room. That was the nature of it. Life does not pause for misunderstanding. It continues, and it reveals what holds and what does not. Behind me, I could hear them move slightly, not leaving, not approaching, just existing in the space in a way that was different from before. No longer occupying. No longer claiming. Just present. I rested my hand lightly against the glass, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingertips, and allowed myself one final moment of stillness. Not to reflect on what had been done, but to recognize what had been clarified. This was never about the apartment. Not really. It was about assumption. About the belief that something could be taken simply because it appeared available. About the quiet decision to act without asking the questions that mattered. I turned back to them one last time, my expression unchanged, my voice steady. Some things are not transferred, I said quietly. They are understood. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to, because now they did understand. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Enough to recognize that what they thought they had secured was never theirs to begin with. Enough to see that control is not established by action alone, but by structure, by preparation, by the decisions made long before anyone else thinks to look. I picked up my purse and held it lightly at my side, not as a signal of departure, but as a completion of movement. The room remained quiet, the air steady, the moment resolved without force, without spectacle. And as I stood there, I realized something with complete clarity. They had believed they were changing my life. In truth, they had only revealed it. Revealed the structure beneath it. Revealed the boundaries they had not seen. Revealed the difference between assumption and reality. And once that difference is seen, it cannot be unseen. The space around us settled fully then. Not with tension, not with conflict, but with something far more definitive. Finality. Not in the sense of an ending, but in the sense of understanding that no longer requires explanation. I turned slightly, my gaze returning to the city beyond the window, and allowed the moment to close exactly as it needed to. Quietly. Completely. Exactly as it should have been from the beginning.